At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters. Brian Clifford handles the legal needs of clients in the construction and property development industries. Brian has been involved in several $1 billion worth of construction projects. His industry experience enables him to collaborate with clients and professionals in multiple disciplines to deliver effective and efficient results. Brian represents owners, developers, investors, design builders, contractors, automation technology integrators, and specialty construction vendors in bringing projects online in locations throughout North America. Mark Voigtman is an innovative, business-minded attorney who partners with clients to complete construction projects and resolve real estate disputes. He leads the firm's construction law and real estate litigation practices. Mark is also the author of the Automation Legal Reference, a guide to legal risk in the automation, robotics, and process industries, published by the North Carolina-based International Society of Automation. He also co-authored a set of contract documents created for a reconsidered model for integrated project delivery used in two $100 million hospital projects. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Julie Weller of Baker Daniels, who will be acting as our moderator for the remainder of the session. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Holly, and thank all of you for joining us for today's webinar, Before the Hot Stove, How to Avoid Getting Burned. My name is Julie Weller, and I am an attorney with Baker Daniels, the attorneys of the CSIA Legal Plan. Joining me today, as Holly introduced, are my fellow CSIA Legal Plan attorneys, Mark Voigtman and Brian Clifford. Those of you who have been CSIA members for a while know what we are talking about when we speak of a hot stove. It comes from a famous saying from the writer Mark Twain, who said, "If a cat sits on a hot stove, that cat won't sit on a hot stove again. But of course that cat won't sit on a cold stove either." In today's webinar, we will discuss common warning signs that integrators may see with a contract, project, or customer that signal a hot stove is ahead. This webinar is a prequel to a fan favorite at the CSIA Executive Conference, the Hot Stove Session, which involved actual CSIA members telling about how they got burned in the past year. That session will be held this year on Friday, May 3rd at 9 a.m. We hope you will be able to join us for it, as Mark will be manning the hot stove this year as its moderator. Speaking of Mark, I'm going to pass the mic off to him to get started. And I see that your first topic is a problem called not enough paper. Isn't that a good thing, Mark?
Well, I suppose that the idea of reducing paper on a project sounds like a good thing, but here it's not. This is a theme that runs through most, if not all, of the projects where the stove gets hot. I mean, the typical scenarios are the project is off to the races. It's too big, it's too important to take time for mere formalities like having a decent contract in place. That can be a typical situation. Another one is just simply bad legal hygiene from both sides. It's very common in the automation arena for things to work on a handshake or a proposal and a purchase order, and then during the project for the scope to change without anybody paying attention that some sort of change management has happened in the form of a change order or formal recognition that the scope has changed. And then long-time relationships between companies that you worked for a while can lead to great informality in contracting, letting down your guard, going forward on a handshake or a promise, and that can be a problem. Too much trust.
So less is usually more, Mark. What can go wrong here?
Can I tell you that basically everything can go wrong? I mean, indefiniteness is the problem. Indefiniteness about what is being built, about what you agreed to build. Indefiniteness about the legal obligations, what your rights are. And then there's big stuff that potentially left unaddressed could destroy your company. And that would be no limitation of liability, big damages. You might be forced to resolve your dispute in a faraway state. You may give up your intellectual property rights to stuff you've worked on to your customer. And your warranties may be completely wrong for the automation application that you're putting in place. I mean, that's just to name a few. And the whole thing could get a lot more expensive. Basically, you're going to be paying lawyers if something goes wrong, if the stove gets hot at the end of the project, 3, 4, 10 times or more what you would have paid a lawyer to get you contracted right in the first place.
How can this be avoided then?
Well, good contracts hygiene, a regular cadence in your company that you've developed, maybe a policy of having more than one set of eyes, look at your paper before you go forward on a project. Spending, might I say, I know it's a little bit self-serving sounding, but maybe a little bit of legal expense on the front end. And I might add that the CSIA legal plan has this product called a basic risk assessment, where it's very cheap, a few $100 to get our eyes on it, to tell you the landmines that may be in your contract ahead of time, simply identifying and calling it out to you what you ought to be looking out for.
Thanks, Mark. All of that is great to know. Next, Brian, what can you tell us about multiple third parties on a project?
Well, this is another scenario that we see in multiple hot stoves. If you've been at the CSIA Executive Conference in the past several years, you have probably recognized this kind of fact pattern on some of the situations that were discussed on the stage. There's a couple different ways that this typically comes up. One is that your customer has existing relationships with vendors for equipment of certain portions of the process, and they want to continue those relationships and essentially hire those vendors directly and then leave you with the integration, automation, software solutions, and other parts of the project. Or, and sometimes these go together, the customer basically is trying to save money by serving as its own project manager, and it really hasn't thought through what that means, and that they will then need to be the coordinating party between several different independent vendors. And then obviously another one that comes up is one that I know Mark's going to talk about here in a few moments, is just legacy systems, and that there were existing products, existing equipment, existing processes at a facility. You're either doing an add-on project, an expansion, or upgrading some solution, and that those multiple third parties might not be active parties today, but they are the ghosts lurking in the project who have been involved previously.
So what have you seen go wrong here?
Well, what really happens is when you have multiple third parties somehow involved in the same project is there's finger pointing. When the process does not work as intended, then everyone's looking to blame someone else. And really, it generally comes down to a lack of integration. To speak to integrators, it's a lack of integration between discrete but related processes. And so what you hear a lot, or what I hear a lot, is there's really unclear scope. And so someone will say, well, I thought it was them, and they thought it was me, when in fact, if you kind of dig into the contracts and the scope of works and the purchase orders and everything else, it turns out it was no one. It was just a gap that the owner had, and now it's upset that the solution's not working as intended, and it was only discovered that there was some gap when everyone, for example, arrived for site acceptance testing, which is not a good time to find that out. So, unclear scope is a big part. Another one is scheduling. Obviously, when there's multiple third parties involved in a project, a delay by one of the vendors can really have an impact on everyone else. And as an integrator, you don't have the contractual mechanism to enforce the schedule against some independent vendor that the owner's hired. It's not like it's a subcontractor or a consultant to you where you have some rights to enforce those terms. You're kind of at the mercy of what the end user decides to do with its independent vendors. So what often happens is the schedule gets compressed. The end user is saying, I still really need this done on time, and I know you've been delayed, but can we just hurry things up? And there's mistakes that are essentially associated with just rushing through what would otherwise be a normal development sequence and the normal sign-offs and check-offs and verifications that go into that process.
So how would you go about controlling other parties that you don't contractually control?
Well, one thing I think that's important is to have a real honest discussion with your customer, with your client, saying, look, I'm hearing you say you want a turnkey solution, and I also hear you're saying you're hiring multiple vendors to do different parts of this project. Those two things just fundamentally don't go together. So, how are we going to resolve that? And really talk to them about how much management time and expense that the end user is going to have to expend to get the project correctly delivered. Sometimes what they're trying to avoid is a markup. They're saying, well, I can handle a bunch of different vendors. You were just going to buy that equipment and install it. Why should I pay your markup on that? I could just buy it directly. Well, the reality is your markup's going into all the sort of back office operations and other ideas that you have come up with to coordinate the services and deliver this kind of turnkey solution. And so, that's, I think, an important discussion to have early in the process. And to the extent that, the horse has left the barn and that you're in a project with multiple third parties, perhaps the owner has already retained or issued purchase orders for those equipment. I think, as Mark just pointed out, more paper is helpful. I think you need to document your expectations of the owner for its coordination of the other vendors so they know what you need and when you need it in order to deliver your solution. And also that you need to notify the owner when those expectations are not met and saying, hey, I was expecting to get this from the other vendor on X date and it's a week late and I still don't have it and that's delaying me. I think you have to raise your hand and speak up if those expectations are not being met. They're going to have an impact on the owner's ultimate satisfaction with the project.
Nice ideas, Brian. So, Mark, our viewers probably often encounter the next issue. What's the deal with legacy systems?
So this is really a subset. We're drilling down a bit more on what Brian was talking about with multiple third-party vendors. It's a danger for integrators stemming from the very definition of the word integrate. The typical scenarios are that there's just an existing system that they're not changing that's tying into yours, or only a part of it is being replaced or remediated, yet there's a connection between your system, the one that you're putting in, and the other things that are going on in the facility. And when I'm talking about systems, existing systems, I could be talking about not just physical systems, physical legacy systems. I could be talking about legacy procedures, operational realities, like maintenance or lack thereof, or safety measures.
So these aren't your systems or your procedures, right? So what could go wrong?
Well, it could be that a minor error that you make, something that you do, causes downstream impacts in the legacy system. And it's sort of the pottery barn problem. You break it, you buy it, so you touch their system by connecting into it, and your system somehow caused their system to screw up. You're blamed. Or it can be, Julie, that your system doesn't take into consideration their bad procedures. Maybe somebody gets injured as a result of your system because you didn't realize that these guys that you're selling it to don't have any good safety practices or have terrible safety practices. And here you kind of come into the workers' comp dilemma. And what that is the injured employee of your customer cannot really go after his employer so much. There's the workers' comp remedy that he's limited to. But he can go after third parties like you, so you're going to be a target even if he had nothing to do with the safety problem that caused the injury.
Well, Mark, how can our viewers prevent these legacy systems from leaving a bad legacy on their next project?
Again, give explicit attention to the issue in your description of scope. What's in, what's out, what's not covered. And then most importantly, we've learned from experience, hard experience, that getting indemnity against injury from your customer, in other words, saying if one of your employees sues us, you will take care of it for us. That's the nature of indemnity. Get that in your contract from your customer. And it's reasonable for them to take care of their own safety procedures. It's hard to argue against that.
Well, thank you, Mark. Those are some great tips for when your project, quite literally, has many moving parts. So next up we have uncertain financing. Brian, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in why people think it's such an unreasonable question to say, hey, so how am I going to get paid for my services and my work product? That seems to be a very uncomfortable question for many integrators to ask. I've never found it to be unreasonable, and so maybe that's why I continually be surprised. And this uncertain financing issue comes up in a couple of different kind of typical scenarios. I mean, it can happen anytime, but the ones I see it most commonly are, one, there's a startup. And so there's a great concept that someone has, but the reality is they need money to get it into production. And you're part of that production process, and it's unclear where that money is going to come from. And the other time it comes up more routinely is when there's this complex third-party financing. So, lately we've been having tax credit, R&D tax credit and other sort of financing available to do improvements or expansions of lines. Maybe there's municipality financing that's coming in to add on to a facility and bring new jobs into the area. Or there's non-traditional lenders that are coming in with so much capital in the market right now, given the economic circumstances. There's a lot of people who are looking for investment opportunities that are outside of big commercial banks who traditionally have provided capital financing for organizations. So, the question is, with those complex third-party financing operations, what are the conditions for the funds to be available? And is your normal work process going to be impacted by those financing obligations? If you're used to being paid monthly, but now there has to be milestones, do you understand where the actual cash is coming from in order to get paid?
Wait, okay. Why would the end user hire you if it doesn't have the money for the project? What's wrong here?
Well, I mean, some of it is you're basically working on faith. It's very rare that I think an end user or a customer is going to come to you and know that they are not going to have the money to pay you and hire you anyway. I mean, normally they have every expectation that they're going to be able to find the money to pay for this once they can kind of get over whatever hurdles it takes to get to the next round of financing, to the next loan from the bank, to the next equity contribution from a contributor, whatever it is. But they're taking that on faith, and frankly, you are too. You're taking on faith, and sometimes you're not paid. And so the question is when you ask, saying, well, who's financing the development project? You are. I mean, you have long or irregular payment cycles, so you're kind of out of pocket to pay payroll, maybe to pay for equipment, and you're basically waiting to be reimbursed for that. I mean, you are the bank of the project in those circumstances. And, the reality is, look, you can't get blood from a stone. So if this company or if this idea doesn't pan out, you are going to be, as the integrator, very far down in the line of bankruptcy. You're just an unsecured trade creditor, and so you are kind of one of the last people to be paid. Everyone else's interests are probably going to be superior to yours.
Money is always a really delicate subject for our viewers to discuss with their end users. So how should this be addressed?
Well, I think you have to broach the topic. I think you do have to ask more questions. And in fairness, I think even just asking one question for a lot of companies could be a big improvement. In other words, where's the money coming from for this to get paid? And how you feel about whatever that answer is may lead to follow-up questions. And I also think, and Mark kind of touched on this before about having multiple sets of eyes on something, I do try to encourage clients to separate out the kind of sales and business development aspects of the job from finance. And if possible, to have different people kind of weighing in, because you don't want to incentivize your sales and business development team to go out there and get all the work if there's no real opportunity for that to get paid in the end.
Definitely something good for our viewers to keep in mind for their next project. Now, Mark, what exactly are insufficient testing guardrails?
Well, it is another unique problem of integrators. There is nearly always some sort of testing on projects, but there are innumerable ways, Julie, of letting testing ruin an otherwise good project. So let's talk about the typical scenarios here. Perhaps in a rush to getting to the end, the customer wants to skip the functional specifications or requirements stage, the step where the integrator puts down on paper or electronically all of the requirements and the logic of what it is that the end user wants to achieve. And maybe they skip that. Maybe they skip the next stage, factory acceptance testing, the time when the process is virtually tested at the integrator's facility. Let's just let's go forward to site acceptance testing. And then in site acceptance testing or acceptance testing of various types, whether it's unit testing or user acceptance testing, there are or can be insufficient on what is required to pass a test. Perhaps the customer keeps adding tests to the project, and that can be a problem.
So what typically goes wrong here?
Well, unending testing, Julie. I mean, you're talking about if they keep adding tests, that's like basically moving the goalposts. And when they skip testing, like skipping FAT, which we see over and over again, it disconnects the whole development process from the way it should be going, and you don't detect problems with the system early enough. So you want to avoid this situation where the customer is making it up as it goes along. There has to be a defined finish line when they stop giving their requirements to you, and everything after that is a change order. And there has to be a defined finish line as to what it takes and what constitutes having passed a test.
How can these problems be avoided?
This is rarely done or not done often, in my view, to anybody's great satisfaction, but you should address testing in the contract. Make cooperation with each step a customer obligation. Functional spec cooperation, participation in factory acceptance testing, and the warranties can be affected if they don't. And the testing should be addressed in the technical specs. They should be defined as a gateway to moving forward to the next stage of development. And then finally, true for so many things, good change management hygiene. If the goalposts keep getting moved, you give notice of a change request each time. And you have to learn how to do it in a way that is diplomatic, pure business, and doesn't turn it into World War III, and that's an art form that every integrator has to achieve.
Keeping things pure business does go a long way. Brian, what do you mean by quote-unquote proposal costs?
Well, my experience has shown me that this is kind of a unique problem among integrators, and it really is because of their expertise. That's really the root cause of it. And so there's a couple of scenarios that come up where you see this. The customer reaches out and they say something like, we know we want something. We just need some help to figure out what. And then, maybe they say, well, of course it will be your project. We just can't commit at this point in time. Or another one I see routinely, and maybe some people on the call have seen this as well, and then a request for proposal goes out, and you get the RFP, and you realize it's going to take a whole team of engineers to fix it. I mean, it's just clear that the RFP did not really have a lot of thought put into it and doesn't have enough detail to allow a solution to be created with any reasonable particularity.
Well, the end user will figure it out eventually, right? So what's wrong with this?
Well, I think the real problem is that you have these specialized skills, and you're providing a ton of value, and all of that value is lost on what normally people kind of call pursuit costs, right? The cost of kind of getting the job. So you're making this huge investment into engineering a solution, and either the customer takes that and isn't paying you for it, or maybe even worse, it takes that and shops it around, and it ends up going with one of your competitors because you've kind of done the hard work to figure out what they needed as a pursuit cost, and then they say, oh, great, thanks, well, give us a proposal, and so will 5 other people, and then we'll choose from there. And so, another possibility is you make this investment on the front end, and the customer simply realizes that its project isn't feasible. And, we've seen this a couple of times, Julie, where you basically are swallowing the cost as the integrator of doing their due diligence on the feasibility of the project. And it's also a bit of a warning sign, kind of an early warning signal that there might be unreimbursed, I think people typically call scope creep. In other words, the customer doesn't know what it wants. It issues a purchase order for a relatively small portion, and then you kind of keep getting a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. But to follow up on what Mark's talked about, without this kind of good change management hygiene, those end up being unreimbursed costs. And you really are performing functions that either you should have been paid for or that the owner should have done prior to retaining you without any reimbursement.
So how would you suggest addressing this?
Well, when I talk to integrators, I try to talk to them about bifurcating solution development from solution implementation. And this goes a little bit with what Mark was just talking about kind of not skipping the functional requirement step. And I think separating those out and saying, look, we're happy to help you come up with a solution that meets your needs and to test it for feasibility and to do the due diligence and to be an active partner with you. And that's going to be phase one, and we're going to get paid for that. Those aren't pursuit costs. We're really providing expertise and value here, and we want reimbursed. And then if we find an acceptable solution, we move on to phase two, and we split these apart. And phase two is when we order the equipment and do the detailed engineering and go through the rest of the acceptance testing process. So I think having those items discussed and being paid for the expertise that you're bringing can be a big help. And another part of this is just protecting your intellectual property. So if you're making this investment on engineering a solution up front, make sure that that your rights to those items are protected, and so that the customer can't kind of take your materials and walk it across the street and see if somebody else can beat you on price after you've made this investment into their facility.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Now, Mark, what do you have to say about the age-old saying that the customer is always right?
Well, what I have to say about that is that the customer is always right is really good business until it becomes really bad business. We're talking about the big opportunity that could lead to greater things. The customer says, great things will be on your way if you help us out here, and you bite the bullet now in the hope of rewards later. It can also be a sort of a we delight customers culture, which is a good thing, but that everybody in business needs to do, but there are limits to that, and there ought to be hard limits, internal stops within your company that keeps that thing from getting out of control. A lot of technology companies have sort of a power-through mentality that has served them well, and they've become bigger and bigger because of it. We always try to delight the customer, and when problems develop, we just sort of power through this. Yeah, the project won't be as profitable, but we power through it, and we get to the end and get out of the project. Well, that powering through can lead to you being up.
So what can go wrong with keeping end users happy? They do keep you in business, after all.
Well, they do keep you in business, but keeping them happy at the risk of your business going down the tubes is not the kind of happiness that is sustainable. So it's zero change management. You find yourself saying, we'll eat that, we'll eat that, we'll eat that, until the meal being served is too big to digest. You can have blinders as a result of customer is always right mentality, blinders to the coming apocalypse. And by the way, the client remembers every promise that you made and blows them all out of proportion. Every little marketing thing you said, including in your proposals, will be blown out of proportion later. And it leaves you in a dispute to defending from the low ground. Well, you kept promising. You kept saying that you were doing it, right?
Yeah. Well, how can you delicately handle this one?
Delicately is the hard part, but you have to learn how to do it. You should speak softly and carry a cold-blooded contract is what I'd say. learn customer-pleasing language that doesn't give away the farm. So instead of saying in your marketing materials, we meet our clients' expectations without fail, perhaps something like, to minimize misunderstandings, we always invest in detailing our customers' expectations in a clear set of written functional specs. And you need to have a good change management hygiene. If the goalposts are being moved, again, give notice of a change request, find a way to make it pure business, not World War III, and then frankly, the discipline, Julie, to tell a customer it is not right, it is wrong.
Great. So our listeners today, if you take anything away from this webinar, remember that the customer is not always right. So this next topic is one that we often see when we're reviewing and negotiating contracts for our integrator clients. Brian, can you tell us more about full IP ownership?
Yeah, sure, Julie. You know, one of the things that makes integrators so successful is this toolbox that they come. I mean, that's why they're the right choice for many of their customers. And there's all sorts of tools in there. You know, there's their standard, templates. There's their, kind of background IP and code that they can kind of reuse for each project to not have to reinvent the wheel. They just have, expertise that they've gained through other experience. And those tools are great and can be incredibly powerful marketing tools. And then they sell the tools. And the toolbox is empty because they didn't, really look through the contract and see what exactly the intellectual property rights were. So, this comes up a couple of times. I mean, one of the most frequent issues is customers don't understand what integrators do. And so they think that they're buying something kind of off the shelf and that, they should just, I paid for it, so it should be mine. And that doesn't really understand what an integrator or an automation company does. And, the reality is, and let's all be candid about it, intellectual property terms just make everyone's eyes glaze over a little bit, including mine. They are not my most favorite provision of a contract to take a look at. I mean, they can be archaic. They can be difficult to understand. They have a language of all their own, work for hire, and has meaning in IP world that doesn't have any intrinsic meaning in any other way. And so they can be really difficult, and I think that's sometimes why people tend to ignore them. And it turns out that what they did is they sold every bit of IP that the company had over to the customer for one single project. And so that's really what we're talking about here.
So what would happen if you do contract away all of your IP rights?
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. I mean, if all of your templates, if all of your standard code, if all of the kind of IP that you had coming into a project suddenly belonged to the customer just because you utilized it to create a particular solution for them, I mean, how would you land the next job? I mean, once it's owned by the customer, that means by corollary, you don't have the right to use that anymore. And, what happens if the project is suspended or canceled? There's a change in market conditions, the company merges, there's new leadership, something happens. Now there's unclear rights in the work product. Can you still use that? Can you not? The contract's not clear. And another thing that happens, and as this industry grows, as we've been involved, and as many of the CSIA members have seen it from garages in the back of people's yards growing into the industry it is now, the reality is that some customers are kind of using integrators' IP to create essentially their own mini integration companies in-house. And so you kind of miss out on this reoccurring source of revenue if you've transferred your intellectual property and the expertise you have to get something done and the toolkits that you have to the customer. Why would they need to pay you? They can just hire somebody directly to do it.
So what should our viewers do then when negotiating these provisions in their next contract?
Well, I think you have to have someone whose eyes aren't just going to completely glaze over to help you with the complex intellectual property terms. I mean, these are areas that are sometimes the most difficult provisions to negotiate because they're intrinsically difficult just to understand. And also, again, clients and customers don't necessarily understand what you actually do. And so that can take a little bit of a update to their knowledge base. One strategy that we've used, as you know, Julie, is to try to separate out custom intellectual property from kind of background intellectual property. So custom being those unique items that are for the end user's process or their equipment or their product, those are all items that maybe it's okay to transfer to them and give them ownership right. But essentially background is everything else. If it's not unique, it's just sort of stuff that kind of comes along with doing the work that you do. And the reality is in some circumstances, no terms are good terms. And so there is kind of implied rights in intellectual property by law. And if the parties don't negotiate contrary provisions, those may be effective. They may be helpful to you more than anything you can negotiate. But it's just really hard to know without having someone who understands intellectual property advise you on what those terms are. Another part is just making sure the customer understands, saying, look, the reason why we can't assign you full IP ownership of everything is because you hired us because you don't want us to reinvent the wheel. You wanted us to come with this project with our expertise and experience. Understand that that's the same thing for the next person down the road. The next client that hires us is going to want the same thing, so we can't give you the wheel. Then we do have to reinvent it each time.
Those are some great tips for negotiating the IP provisions in your next contract. So, Mark, what can you do when an end user gets new management?
Well, this is a sign of trouble, Julie, that goes along with all of the other problems we've been talking about. You've been working with your contact person for years, and suddenly she is out or she announces her retirement. Often then the incoming manager at the customer comes in, and right or wrong, they either have a mandate to clean up the previous person's processes, even if they don't need cleaning up, or they just want to establish themselves as the new sheriff in town, right?
Yeah. Well, what have you seen go wrong here?
So every prior technical decision is second-guessed. The project itself is changed, it's chopped up, it's canceled. Maybe the personalities aren't a good fit. Maybe the prior project lead, you might have signed an extremely one-sided contract maybe 4 years ago. You had this guy that you knew and loved. And there are these strict terms that have never been enforced in the contract. And suddenly the new guy is starting to enforce these in a hyper-technical way, and you're in trouble.
Well, at the end of the day, our viewers can't control their end users' personnel. So what can be done to negate some of these negative effects?
Well, you're absolutely right. There are limits on how much you can control things like that happening to you. But again, good contract management, just because you have a good guy now doesn't mean you won't have you will have that guy being your contact person later on. So make sure that the contracts you sign are good to begin with, regardless of the personalities. Change management hygiene, again, we mention that constantly. You can make the continuity of the project lead a material term so that if it changes, that there are parts of the contract or its price that can be renegotiated. And then this is more of a soft approach, but give attention to the transition. Don't assume that things are going to be the same when the new person comes on. You've got to invest in the relationship. Meet that person, take them out to dinner, educate them, assist that person, and then finally call foul when you're being run over. Refer to my prior statements regarding the customer is always right.
That's right. Thank you, Mark. So, Brian, what happens when your contact with the end user is no longer in contact?
Yeah. Well, this is unresponsiveness is a problem everywhere. The project requires active and engaged participation, and all you're hearing is crickets. So this happens a couple of different ways. I mean, an early warning sign is that it just takes months to hear back about the contract or the revisions. You've had the planning meeting, you've all gotten together, everyone's shaking hands, and we know, and they say, well, we're going to issue a contract and a purchase order, and we'll have you take a look at it, and there's just nothing after week after week after week. Obviously, that's not a great sign that the company is particularly responsive. Another way that we see it is that you've asked for confirmation about a solution proposal, and just no one's willing to kind of take responsibility for committing to the path forward. It's all, oh, that sounds good, but I need to talk to somebody else, and there's just a lot of churn on actually saying, yes, let's go down this path, or no, we need to change directions here. And another unresponsive is just invoices are due, and no one can tell you where your payments are. That's another type of unresponsiveness we frequently see.
So what problems are encountered here then?
Well, it really depends on what stage the unresponsiveness starts. I mean, really, rework, unmet expectations due to the lack of communications. If they're not telling you the path forward, for example, as Mark was mentioning before, in the functional specifications creation process. There's frustration on the project team. No one likes kind of being blown off, and the reality is that leads to confrontations that otherwise would have been maybe handled in a routine business-like way. Now, because of the frustration on unresponsiveness, it's a lot more finger pointing. And for the integrators, I mean, sometimes that means you're not picking up your boss's call. If he's saying, I know that person's calling me because they want to know where the payment is on this invoice, and I still don't have an answer, it's not a great position to be in internally with your company.
Well, you can't force someone to respond to you. So what can be done to prevent unresponsiveness?
Yeah, that's true. I think you have to be upfront about expectations and milestones. This goes back to what we were talking about before. Put a process in the contract as opposed to just the deliverables. And I think it helps to identify an actual person as the project lead for each party. And this goes along with what Mark was talking about, maybe the continuity of the project team's a material term. It can't just be a representative. No, I mean, we need to talk to Susan or to Bill in order to get approval for this, and give them the authority to make decisions that can't be overruled or second-guessed if there is maybe a change in management or somebody else comes in. And the reality is, don't be part of the problem. Be responsive yourself. Obviously, you can't really take the high road on some of these items if you yourself have not been responsive to the customer's inquiries. And I think you do need to provide for suspension rights and an adjustment in the price and schedule when there's either decisions that need to be made to keep the project on track, or you're not getting payments in accordance with the agreed upon milestones that everyone accepted up front. I think you have to be able to kind of do something to enforce those remedies.
Those are great practice tips. Thank you, Brian. Now on to something that no one likes. Mark, tell us about empty promises.
This will be quick. It's another species of the customer right mentality. Work with us on this, and there'll be more work for you in the future. So it involves your company eating overruns or postponing billing. It's usually indefinite. It's almost writing. And it almost always involves you, the integrator, having some sort of optimism bias, looking with really rose-colored glasses without any basis in reality.
Well, what can go wrong with the glass being half full, Mark?
With being an optimist, what can go wrong?
Yeah.
Well, the person that the customer who made the promise gets transferred or disappears, then you've invested a bunch of time in nothing, because the new guys are going to say, what? We didn't promise that. The customer suffers a downturn or cuts back on its plans. And then ultimately your company can go upside down in its investment in the hope of future work. And you know what? The customer probably doesn't have any idea how much time you put into it, always underestimates what you did, so thinks nothing of your investment and not getting paid for the promises. And they basically will view your overrun as marketing that just didn't pan out.
Well, this seems tricky, so how can you avoid this without offending the end user?
Don't play the game in the first place. It's okay to hope for more, but keep the projects separated. The future project is a future project. Don't invest in it now. Invest in it if you got the job and you have a contract. But if you're going to play that game, keep the deal in writing, ideally in some form of change management. Keep the customer strictly in the loop as to what amounts you are incurring and that you expect to bill later. And then have a defined limit to whatever you're willing to invest in this future promise that the customer is aware of.
Thank you, Mark, for those tips. Brian, how does reputation affect our viewers' work?
Well, reputation is important for our integrators to land the project, but I think sometimes there's too little attention paid to the reputation of the people who are hiring integrators. So there's a couple of, examples that I've had in the past where the customer kind of has a history of problem, either with integrators specifically or really maybe just with all of its vendors. So a couple of scenarios to be looking out for. Are you the first vendor on this project? If you're not, what happened to the previous company? And why didn't that work out? Maybe there's a perfectly reasonable explanation, but not knowing is a problem. Are there other vendors who haven't been paid? Or is there a history of litigation that this customer has kind of a record of suing or bringing claims against its consultants, its engineers, its vendors?
So this end user has been fine with you so far, so what's wrong with that?
Well, you definitely don't want to be just the next chapter in this customer's kind of long story. And, a lot of times when this comes up, I'll talk to a client, and, I think the phrase I hear the most frequently is that, I knew I should have walked away from that project. And sometimes it is the best project that you do in a year might be the one that you didn't accept.
How do you decide whether to take a project based on an end user's reputation?
Well, look, I think you just have to do some basic due diligence. I think you ask around. You might check some references. You can check for lawsuits, see if they've appeared in lawsuits as, the plaintiff against a claim. Frankly, reading the company news and not the ones that they publish on their website, but maybe a Google search can tell you a lot about the company's reputation and history in working with other people. Another thing to think about, and we talked a little bit about this before, is that, look, sales and business development are obviously important for every integrator, but so is risk management. And so don't let the sales and business development decisions kind of be dominant over all other decision-making processes in the company. And, I think you have to trust yourself. A lot of times I think people look back and they think, I had a gut feeling that something was just off and I couldn't put my finger in it, but I kind of knew. It's very rare that people are utterly shocked that a relationship with the customer really went sideways on them.
That is some great advice. Trust your instincts. And don't let your project be a story at next year's hot stove session. And finally, Mark, what do we mean by no wiggle room?
This is when you're sent a contract and they say we don't make any changes. And as we all know, any problem that we've been talking about during this webinar is made worse by a contract that is one-sided against you. So they typically say stuff like, we're not allowed to change these terms, or we have to go back to our lawyer with any changes. Or they say, our other vendors don't make any changes. And then the customer could send you an inappropriate agreement that has nothing to do with this industry, like a product or goods agreement that doesn't relate to automation, a construction agreement made for sticks and bricks contractors. It may even send you the contract in PDF, which is sort of a suggestion that they're not willing to make any changes.
So I know what can go wrong with this one, Mark. Anything and everything. So how should you respond to the end user?
Well, you just recognize the terms that should be deal killers for you, first of all. And when they say we're not allowed to change these terms, I think your response is something like, you cannot really be expecting us to risk our entire company for every project we do. That's not a sustainable business plan. If they say, we have to go back to our lawyer with any changes and we don't want to do that, I think you say, understood. Would it be helpful if we put our lawyer in touch? That usually works. If they say our other vendors don't ask for changes, you say something like, understood, but we think there's an advantage to your company doing business with a company with a sustainable business plan like ours, and we don't think it's a sustainable business plan to put our company up for risk every time we do a single project. So if the customer sends you an inappropriate form of agreement, that's a gift because it's basically telling you to point that out and say, look, we'll put together some terms and conditions that work for automation projects that are more appropriate than this. Other approaches, and here comes the self-serving part, Julie, use the CSIA legal plan for our basic risk assessments, as I mentioned before. There's also something that we call the CSIA legal rider, which is sort of a last gasp approach to dealing with the customer that says we don't change our anything in our contracts. And then, look, if there is anything that is the best advice at all, walk away from the project. Walk away, as Brian says. The best project you do may be the one that you don't do.
Great. Thank you, Mark and Brian, for these hot tips on what to look out for the next time you take on a new project. And as we've discussed, if you're noticing some of these warning signs in your own contract negotiations or projects, a friendly reminder to our CSIA members that as a part of your CSIA membership, you are entitled to the benefits of the CSIA Legal Plan, which entitles you to free and reduced price legal services from the three of us and our colleagues at Faegre Baker Daniels. So now we're going to open the floor for questions. You can enter those in the chat box, and I will read them off to Mark and Brian, and they will respond. So our first question...
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a question?
There is. Becca asks, thank you, Becca, for your question. Sometimes it's challenging to determine what you should charge for proposal efforts and when you shouldn't. Do you have any criteria to help us make this determination?
Yeah, I can take that. That is hard. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that question, as I'm sure you anticipated. And I know everyone gets frustrated when lawyers tell them, well, it just depends. So I try not to do that. What I would suggest is that you just have to set a threshold, and you have to have an internal mechanism to track. Certainly, business development expenses are a part of overhead, and they're a reality for all companies. And some of that is going to be investing in understanding your client, your customer, your potential client or customer's needs. But I think two ways to go about that is, one, if it is the marketing team, if your organization has severed those functions out, those might be fine. Those are overhead. But as soon as they have to pick up the phone and call the engineering department or whoever else estimating, maybe you have to think, hey, that's now flipped. That's not marketing or pursuit costs anymore. That now is providing value to the customer, and that's something that we should be paid for. The other way is just to track the hours that are being spent, especially in the smaller organizations where you haven't necessarily split marketing and business development away from actual engineering time, and say, well, look, we're happy to spend 5 hours or 10 hours on this. Once it gets past that, we need to have something in place to be reimbursed for that time. And I think if you have a candid conversation with customers, especially the business team hasn't kind of got escalated to legal yet, I think they understand. I think they're actually very receptive of saying, okay, yeah, we might need a small consulting agreement to kind of do the due diligence and get things worked out. And, we can kind of put a pause on it at that point before we issue a full contract. And that does help mitigate the risk that what really was, kind of programming expenses or initial schematic design is really just swallowed up in pursuit costs.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Our next question comes from Karen. What do you recommend for dealing with a client who has a previously poor reputation but has been merged or bought out by another company?
Well, I'll take that one. I mean, I think that it could be a new start. It could mean good things for the relationship, but there certainly are some questions to ask there. Just because the subsidiary has been difficult or litigious in the past doesn't mean that it will not continue in that vein. So I don't think that simply because it has been acquired necessarily means anything. If anything, it perhaps represents an opportunity for change, an investigation, and some feeling good about the situation before going forward.
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any additional questions at this time?
Well, we look forward to seeing everyone who is a CSIA member who's attending this webinar and who's also attending the Asheville, North Carolina event. We look forward to seeing you there.
Great. Thank you all for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I just want to thank Mark, Brian, and Julie for this discussion and remind everybody that a recording of this will be posted on the website within 2 weeks. That'll conclude our program for today. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.